Introducing our esteemed speaker.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much for being here. I'm very delighted to be here in front of you today and also remotely. So today I'm going to present Gaia-X, what it stands for, why it was created. We will go through 20-minute presentation and then Q&A from a top-down point of view. Why, where we are, and what do we work on right now. So Gaia-X was created, the first time Gaia-X was mentioned was about 3 years ago, but legally speaking, the entity exists from 1 year ago. And our goal, our target was, how do we enable data to flow? Basically, we came from an assessment that was, how do we make Europe a leader in AI? For AI, you need to have data and software. And how do we enable this data, those data, to be shared across organization? Not just only within organization, which are things that are known today, but across organization. How do we enable to have the user willing to share their data in a private and controllable way across organization? So that's what we try and want to do. One of the things that sometimes is easier is to start to define what we are not. So Gaia-X is not a standardization body. We are not going to release a platform or to release a cloud provider. We are not a broker. And we are defining, and we don't, operate services ourselves. So we are really promoting an architecture where we promote decentralization and a federation of autonomous ecosystems. The thing that we work on, however, are the following. We have specification. We work on a reference implementation of those specifications, and we work on labels. My background as a software developer, it's extremely important to have a reference implementation. We do have specification. There are already a lot of existing specification, but we do believe that to show that it's really working, we need to have a reference implementation. So we do have a community, an open source community. We do have project that works on identity, catalogs, data connectors, data exchange. And we are also working on setting up standards for enabling the digital trust. And that's what we call and refer to as labels. So if you have witnessed to one of Gaia-X's previous presentation, you might have seen a big X with a bit of data services at the top, infrastructure services, and few boxes here and there. I'm not going to use this picture, and I'm trying now to define to present you our new architecture. So first, let's start by definition. And you will see that during the course of this presentation, I will emphasize a lot on to be able to have interoperable system, we need to have a common vocabulary. So Gerex Ecosystem, what is it? It's the virtual set of participant service offering that fulfills the same set of rules, a common digital governance. We talk a lot about creating those space for sharing data spaces. I will refer them here as ecosystems. So you might have one ecosystem about IoT, banks, banking sectors, insurance, health, transport, energy, defense. How do we enable them to be interoperable? And there are several layers of interoperability. The first thing to notice is that you have a lot of existing infrastructure. So we don't try to define a new standards from scratch and asking you please adopt it. That will not work. We are here to define what is the common set of rules that everyone agrees when we talk about KYC, when we talk about data exchange. Do we have the same definition of terms and conditions? Do we have the same vocabulary when we talk about end-user license agreement? What does it mean to talk about private data? How do we compile, gather, store user consentment? So the architecture we have is within each ecosystem, you have existing services. They have different infrastructure. You might have different layer 2, layer 3 interconnection, different type of VM, sometimes open source, OpenStack. Sometimes you will use private solution, VMware, Nutanix, and so on. But we can come up with the same vocabulary. So before on the market in the IT, you have infrastructure as code. a way for developers, for DevOps, to describe how they want their infrastructure to be deployed and to operationalize, to deploy that across cloud providers. Why don't we have the same thing for compliance? Compliance as code. So instead of spending time and hours of reviewing contract, regulation, we can have a common digital governance, and that's what we refer as the Gaia-X Trust Framework. That will be the minimum set of rules that members, that participants agree on. And we have a lot of existing framework in Europe we can leverage for that. For example, in Europe, we have the EIDAS regulation for digital identity, but it's not used or adopted widely in every country in Europe. I will probably mention Estonia on one side, and as a French, I will allow myself to mention France on the other side of the spectrum. So every country have a different level of adoption for those existing regulations. And part of the work that we are doing at Gaia-X is to identify the existing legislation that enable us to build this digital governance for digital services for exchanging data in a safe and secure way, including the user. For going a bit further into the architecture, I will go and describe and use an existing model that is part of the NIST, and that's a cloud reference architecture. And we have different planes. I'm going to give you an analogy of those different planes with things that we are all aware of. The digital governance, it's like having the passport. Every state is sovereign when they issue their passport. But when you go abroad, your passport will be recognized by another country. You move from here to the US, they will recognize your passport when you go to the border. They might not be willing to let you in because you will require a visa. That will be the management plane. That's like an extension of these governance rules. The same way, you have the same way in the IT world. You have a common governance for what is an identity, the basics of KYC. Can we have a common number for all companies across Europe and outside of Europe? We don't have that right now, or we have it, but it's not widely adopted. It's quite hard to be able to identify with a good level of confidence one organization, or it requires paperwork and review by lawyers. We can automate that. We have the tools, we have all the legislation in Europe to automate that. Then you have the management plane, like it's a visa, it's an additional set of rules that each user will have to fulfill in order to be using the data within that ecosystem, within the health, within the finance, within the edge. And then the usage plane. Usage plane, that will be the technical interoperability. It's the same way to follow on the example with the US. You go to the US, you want to use a power socket, it's 110 volt, 60 hertz. In Europe, we have 240, 50 hertz. But because we are using the same vocabulary, hertz, amps, hertz, we are able to understand each other and to build bridges. That's what we focus on. We are not trying to build a new standards that try to be, and to force that as the adoption for everyone. What we define and work on is a common governance, common vocabulary to enable those 3 layers of interoperability. Digital governance, a way to express additional rules, and technical interoperability at the top. So where are we now? Gaia-X is an association, as I mentioned, that was legally founded a year ago. We have about 334 members right now, all over Europe and outside of Europe. We have members that are large, very large corporation companies, banks, automotive industries, but also SMEs, and a lot of SMEs. We know that in Europe, most of our market come from small, medium enterprise. A lot of our economy comes from small, medium enterprise. And we are working closely with the European Commission. In terms of structure in the association, that's very classical. I will not spend time through the next few slides. We have a board director, technical committees, a management team, few working groups. Every working groups are powered by the member of the association. They are tackling specific areas. So we have working groups dedicated to, for example, working on the digitalization of contract or network composition, identity and access management across cloud providers. For example, we saw an advertisement earlier about single sign-on. It's great, but we have so many single sign-on. How do we make them interoperable? In terms of development, just to mention also that we take operationalization very seriously. We do have a lab with a team of developers, and we really prototype every hypothesis we are making inside the specification. So this is not just a matter of writing PDF, but we also make sure that what we work on is actually doable. And now into the core of the Gaia-X compliance. When we talk about Gaia-X, we've heard also about sovereignty. What does it mean? I will be very direct. Sovereignty, that's for sovereign. I'm not. I'm an individual. I have my own physical integrity, and being part of organization, I can control my level of autonomy. And there is basically two main categories of autonomy: the legal one and the technical one. The legal one, we are all aware of that. That's the application of non-European law, for example. How do you manage your KYC? How do you manage your usage policies for handling data? I'm going to refer that as usage policy. On the technical part, you can split that under two categories: the data and the hardware. For the hardware, that's out of scope for Gaia-X. There are other initiatives in Europe, like the IPSA-SIS, taking care of that. On the data, I will extend the definition a bit. We refer a lot of time to data as the data set, the analytical data. But to be able to use data, you need to have software. AI is powered by data and software. Without the control of the software you are using to extract value out of your data, you don't have autonomy. And it's extremely important part of this compliance by code automation to find criteria that are measurable and comparable, to identify, to have transparency of which software you are using, which stack do you depend on. You have access to the data, fine. But if the software that allows you to process your data is bound to a license or to a foreign country you have no leverage on, or that are outside of the jurisdiction your country you are living in, then you have a huge dependency on something that you have no control over. And unfortunately, we saw this situation not a long time ago with the war in Ukraine, where a lot of private corporations decided from their own to stop providing services. And it doesn't depend on any court order. They have decided because every software asset has a license and a copyright. So they can decide to stop selling you software and licenses. And that's a level of dependency that we are trying to make more transparent. So you will say that, yes, in my relation to one hyperscalers, I know exactly what I'm depending on. Yes, but when, again, in Europe, we have a lot of SMEs that are using other SMEs and so on, this chain of services, sometimes it's very difficult to know exactly where the data is located. So what is the level of legal autonomy, and which stacks do we really depend on? The technical autonomy basically is governed by two sets of rules: access control, and that's very well known, and policy usage. Usage policy, it's a bit tricky. In the physical world, when you want to move an object, when you want to share an object, you move the object. In the digital world, when you want to share an object, you copy the object. And there is hardly a way to make sure that once you hand over your data, it's going to be used exactly the way that you want that data to be used, except if you have some technical mean or legal mean to control that. I've mentioning here trusted execution enclave, fully homomorphic encryption, multi-party computation, and so on. Those are technology that enables to control in certain degree how the data will be used. But to move at scale, usually you refer to a legal contract, so that's why I'm referring here to usage policy. In terms of compliance, what we have right now is most of the time this. We are going to use that, but we are not going to define a new qualification schema that you can print and hang on the wall. We are really striving to make sure the SMEs are able to use our reference implementation and our standards. So Gaia-X define a high-level set of rules that are split in two. Something that we call the trusted services, or the trust framework, that is compulsory, and that's the set of measurable and controllable attributes to gain trust. So basically, how do you measure things? And then labels. And we have three different level of labels. So the three levels that we have are more and more constraining as we go higher, up to the point where we define what is legal sovereignty, so we have offerings that are not depending on non-European extraterritorial law. In terms of trust framework, I'm going to go a bit quicker because I still have a lot of things I would like to share. The trust framework, that will be a way to measure and control the attributes of services and data. For that, we have mainly 4 areas. So now we start to go a bit into the details of criteria that we measure. When you have a service, we will write like the identity card of the service. And by service, I'm also mentioning data. The claim, so we have a set of attributes that we want to make there available and mandatory. For example, when you're sharing data, sharing services, or using services, you have always the information about license and copyrights and who is providing it. The who is providing it, that will be an organization or legal participant. Which identity is being used, so like a unique identifier of the company. Those claims, they will be signed by the trust of those claims. The trust that associated with those claims come from the envelope. Who signed it? So for that, we are leveraging the IDAS framework. So when you sign something with your IDAS certificate, it's binding you legally to the claim you are making. And we are also making and checking the value of the attribute themselves. So if you are expecting an email addresses, we will make sure that that's an email addresses. Gaia-X in 2022. So where do we want to go? Yes. I started the presentation by Gaia-X was created because we want to exchange data. So we have obviously a strong emphasis on that. So we are going to focus more on data exchanges. As I mentioned earlier, data or value is extracted from data because you have, well, the black box in the middle that we call AI, but AI, that's software. And you have a lot of different steps in your data pipeline. All organizations here around the table and remotely, I'm quite sure you know how to do these data pipelines within the organization. However, how we do that, instead of having about 10 different steps within the organization, 10 across 10 SMEs. Right now, that will be a huge burden to review all the contracts, to configure all the platforms, because you have different vocabulary for expressing the different rules and regulation. And if we isolate 2 of those steps, what are the key pillars that we need to enable and to work on to enable the exchange of data across those 2 steps? Identity attributes, so how do we have a common identity access? The data protocols to have interoperability at the usage plane. The policy negotiation, and that's where we have a strong emphasis on how do we automate policy negotiation. We do have vocabulary. There are already standards that enable us to express that. The same way we are expressing policy negotiation when we consume infrastructure. We can do that with data. Do I allow my data to be sub-licensed, to be exchanged, to be modified, to be merged with another data set, and so on? We need to find this common vocabulary of what are the actions that are able to do with our data. The traceability of that consent. When you get an exchange of data, you want to make sure that you are able to refer to that exchange later in an immutable, traceable way. And finally, if you want to consume data, you need to be able to find it. So for 2022, if we need to go a bit deeper into what we work on, identity and access management, how do we find this common vocabulary of access and identity management? We are not working on a new specification for OpenID Connect. That's not our target. But we want to work on what is the definition of KYC? What is the definition, what makes a participant really a participant across CSPs, across different data providers, a data controller, data provider. Policy negotiation, we do have, so for the most sticky, we have here an example of Rego where we enable to compute policies based on attributes that are being signed by a cryptographic key from IDAS framework. The consent traceability, same thing. We need to be able to build this common digital governance for enabling data to be shared across organizations. If we are not using the same vocabulary, the data is going to stay as in silo. And finally, the service discoverability, this capacity to compose services. I'm not going to teach you anything. Europe has a highly fragmented market right now. And if we want to be able to compose those services together, this is like doing Legos. We need to find a common interface, to find a common vocabulary to enable those interoperability. So that's the goal of the association, Gaia-X Association, to work on those 3 layers of interoperability. A common, if I have to summarize, and that will be the end, to find a common digital governance, leveraging the existing ones. And for that, we are really proud to have a lot of members from different countries, from almost all the countries in Europe, and from every sectors: industry, health, defense, space, transport, energy, finance, insurance, and to work on defining what is the vocabulary for enabling organization to exchange services and data together, to enable what we saw in the previous slides, free flow of data. Not free in terms of monetization, obviously, but free in terms of I'm able to consume and to exchange them. Thank you very much. I will be very happy to take questions.
Merci beaucoup, Pierre. I just try to show off all my French. Merci beaucoup. Je m'appelle Julia, j'habite Visby. That's it. So let's go back to English. Thank you. I really had the opportunity to talk to you before this. It was quite interesting, and I learned a lot of things I didn't know anything about it. But I was wondering, how will this make an impact on the business economy? Like, if we got this common language, you might not need to have different cloud providers. I don't know. Will it have an impact on the business economy?
I do believe that having different cloud providers is important, and I think that the way we are doing hybrid cloud is really a trend now. But when you are doing a hybrid cloud between 1 or 2 hyperscale providers, that's not what we call hybrid cloud. Hybrid cloud for me will be really being able to scale your infrastructure close to your customers, using all the possible SMEs, small medium enterprise, that are providing services where your customers are. And right now, if you have to build this entire infrastructure across different actors, you will spend a lot of time reviewing contracts, terms and conditions, because you don't have the same vocabulary for doing that.
It's quite a project, finding a common vocabulary.
We did it. I'm sure we will do it. We did it for Europe. We managed to create Europe. It wasn't easy. We managed to do it. The Schengen area, to find a common set of rules for enabling us today, me from France moving to Stockholm today. We managed to create GDPR, a common framework for the personal data. And we need to work, and we will manage to have a common governance for digital services.
Well, common and common. You gave me an example how it could work and how it doesn't work. You're French.
Yeah.
We all love France, but you also lived in Estonia for 5 years.
That's correct.
And you also had a baby there.
Correct.
And it was quite easy having a baby in Estonia.
So the full story. I've been living in Tallinn. I was working even in building next to here when I was in Microsoft. So my first child was born in Tallinn. When we arrived at the hospital, we had both, my wife and I, our digital ID card, an IDAS ID. We went to the hospital, they plugged the card in the computer. About 10 minutes later, our daughter had a serial number. So it doesn't sound very human-friendly, but it's very efficient.
But you were just like, welcome, number 2244.
Exactly.
Yep.
And then we have 1 month to give her a name. In France, that's quite different. So when we were there, the first child was born there. 48 later, we receive an email from the States asking us, please, Pierre, do you allow ourselves to ask your employee your pay slip? Are you okay if we contact the Social Security, I don't remember exactly the name, to see if you have any child allowance? That's a way to ease the life of a citizen. And in 48 hours, without knowing the rights, the language, how to do things, everything was set up and ready. That was Estonia in 2030.
So you remember when your daughter was born?
Yes, that's what I'm trying to see how bad I am now. when we move back to France, being able to declare our child born from 2 French citizen parents with a French nationality abroad, it took us 5 months of paperwork. France is part of the IDAS regulation, that's part of Europe, but we don't yet have the same level of adoption of digital governance. And by digital governance, the other example I'm giving is that we still use check in France. I mean, that's something that no one here does, as understood, but we do use a lot of stamps to send letters and check in France.
Stamps and checks. But the greatest thing, when you moved back from Estonia, you told me also that you had to really print a paper and...
Yes, I had to print papers, to sign them, and as an IT engineer, living in Estonia for 5 years, going back to France, that was painful. I love France, I mean, that's that, don't get me wrong. But again, having a common vocabulary, having the same set of standards for describing things is mandatory if we want really to enable Europe to be successful. Right now, European is highly fragmented. We saw that also with the COVID. I mean, we have part of France in one area of France, the border within 100 kilometers radius. Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, Switzerland, and France. They all have different regulation for storing and exchanging health reports, health records of like patients, humans. But the COVID doesn't stop at the border. So how do we enable the analysis of the spreads of COVID if every country has within 100 kilometers radius different regulation? Just because the regulation don't use the same words and we don't have the common vocabulary. That's very important if we really want to create a successful European economy at scale.
We have a question for you here. Trust framework. Can you talk a little more about use case in this framework?
Yes. One of those use cases will be data exchange. So I'm going to give an example. As a data owner, you might not want your data to be subject to non-European legislation, jurisdiction. So you want to set a rules that your data is going to be consumed only by participants with a European identity, or to be stored on servers that are operated, not just only located, but operated by European players. And the way we are doing it is you describe your services, so imagine like a text file. You sign those claims using your IDAS identity that legally bind you to the claims you just made. And you have a policy engines that are already existing also. We don't need to define new ones. We already have language that enables to compute that enables to assess, to ensure that your data is going to only be consumed by participants on services provided by European players.
Thank you, Pierre. It said here that you have a Swedish organization. I know there's 14 hubs around Europe, but do we really have a Swedish hub yet?
So we have the association, the Gaia-X association, and we do have also national hubs. We have 14 national hubs in Europe. I think that the Swedish hub is ongoing. Ongoing?
On its way?
On its way.
It might happen.
I will be very happy.
After today, it will happen.
Thank you.
I don't know, I hope so.
And we also have 2 hubs internationally. We have 1 hub in Japan and 1 hub in South Korea. And the reason for that is we are working on digital governance based on European values. And European values of data privacy, transparency, interoperability, openness are values that are shared even outside of the European economic area. So Japan has 1 hub, South Korea also, because they adhere to the same principles of European values.
Wonderful. So we hope after today you can still talk to Pierre during the break. There's soon going to be, and we'll hope that we have 4 businesses, companies in
That's correct.
Yeah?
You are very well informed.
I'm very informed. I had the best. But I also know that Finland have 6. So that's a challenge for more of you to work with Gaia-X. Merci beaucoup, Pierre.
Welcome.
Det är dags för kaffepaus.